Thank you very much, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're actually now halfway through our series of data related webinars. Last week we looked at a best practices case study, and this week we're looking at the topics of governance and consumer privacy, and next week we'll be diving into some details around identity and what's happening with Tech Lab's Project Rearc and taking a look at the privacy sandbox. So please look out for that. Today I'm very ably assisted by 4 industry experts as participants, and you'll be meeting them all later on during the Q&A, which will be hosted by Ben Sharp from Salesforce. But before we get into that Q&A, I'm going to give a bit of background to what we're up to in the IAB Data Council and some of the projects across the IAB that are pertinent to these topics. And before that, we'll have a presentation from Anna. Now, just before I introduce Anna Johnston, who's principal at Salinger Privacy, I'd like to just warn you that there's a little bit of interactivity that's required for Anna's presentation. There's a poll, so be ready, get involved, and the quicker you respond, the more seamless the experience for everyone. So to set us up nicely with a presentation on the privacy landscape for 2020, and please introduce Anna Johnston from Salinger Privacy. Thank you very much. Take it away, Anna.
Thanks, JJ. Now let me just share my screen for you. Okay, can I just check that you can see my slides now, JJ? Great, thanks. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and my particular thanks to the IAB for inviting me to join your webinar, and in particular to Ben and JJ for moderating this discussion. So I am the principal of Salinger Privacy. We are a specialist privacy consulting, training and resources firm. We're based in Sydney and Melbourne. I come from a legal background. And before that, in the public sector, I was a Deputy Privacy Commissioner in New South Wales some time ago. So that's the kind of lens I bring to things is usually legal and policy, coming from that kind of legal and policy background. So I've been asked to spend about 15 minutes giving you a high-level overview of the privacy regulatory landscape in Australia, and in particular what I think is coming around the corner, both here and both locally and globally, obviously with a focus on digital advertising. So in my 15 minutes or so, I'll do a little bit of scene setting, a bit of myth busting, cover off a couple of foundational concepts, and then we'll get into looking at regulatory developments and future directions, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's get cracking. So when it comes to the application of privacy law to the world of marketing and advertising, I often hear that privacy laws are a barrier. You know, privacy laws create a barrier to innovation and to the industry. But I'd like to start by having you think about the role that privacy law plays in the development of new technologies and the functioning of markets in particular. Now, when I was in high school, I had an English teacher who had a really good way of keeping the boys' attention when we were studying, 17th century romantic poetry, and their attention would drift. So every now and again, he would put up an overhead of a sexy car. This was obviously back in the day when teachers used overheads. We didn't have PowerPoints or smartboards or anything then. So for those of you who don't already realise that privacy is a sexy subject, let's start instead with this car. Now, here's the audience participation point. I want you to imagine that I've just given you this brand new car, brand new sports car. You're on a German autobahn where there is no speed limit. It's a beautiful clear day. It's a straight road. There is not another car in sight. Here is your first poll question. How fast are you willing to go? So we'll give you a couple of seconds to nominate quite how fast you're willing to go in your sexy new sports car. And then we'll see the results. Okay, so we've got, okay, interesting spread. We've got the kind of conservative 150 few people in the middle, and then, you know, 31% of you are complete rev heads, ready to push that car as far as you can go. Fantastic. So, oh no, there's something I forgot to mention. There's no brakes in this car. Also, there's no seat belts. So here's your second poll question. Now you know that there's no brakes and no seat belts. Now how fast are you willing to go? So a couple more seconds to let you have a think about that and nominate your answer. And we'll see what you think. Okay, so 11% of you are still going for it. But obviously, almost everybody else, the vast majority, have massively toned down how fast they're willing to drive the car. So, so thanks, Tiffany. You can close that poll for us. So here's my point. I actually don't think of privacy laws as a barrier. I think of privacy laws as the brakes and the seatbelts in the car, because when you think about it, it's not so much the accelerator that helps you go fast, it's the brakes. If you don't have brakes, you can't drive as fast. And the seatbelts are also there to catch you if something goes wrong. So that's how I conceive of privacy laws. They're not a barrier to innovation, they're actually an enabler. So now let's get into some of the foundational concepts in privacy law and clear up a couple of misunderstandings. And the first point I'd like to make is to clear up a fairly common misunderstanding that I hear in the community, and that is that privacy law is only about private data. And the most recent example of this misunderstanding in a fairly public way was from the founder of Clearview AI, which is a facial recognition app being trialled by law enforcement agencies in the US and apparently by some police officers here as well without proper authorization. And Clearview AI built their app by scraping 3 billion photographs from the internet, from sites like Facebook and YouTube and Flickster and plenty of others. And when questioned about the legality and ethics of this practice, the company's response was, well, it's all just data in the public domain. There's no privacy issues here. But just because you come across a photo on the internet does not mean you are legally, let alone ethically, free to copy and use it for your own purposes. There are intellectual property issues and sometimes commercial issues. So Facebook's terms and conditions, for example, prohibit the practice of scraping photographs off their site. But there is also privacy law, which regulates the collection of personal information. And when you look at the Australian Privacy Act, it has no exemption from the collection rules. So there's rules around collecting personal information. There's no exemption for, I found it in the public domain. You know, I found it on the internet. So just like if you find a wallet in the street, it still belongs to someone else. And if you take it for yourself, you are committing theft. So believing that privacy law is only about what might be described as private data is a common misunderstanding, but in fact, Privacy Act regulates all personal information. It doesn't matter if that piece of information is publicly found or privately held. It doesn't matter if it's considered private in the sense of being a secret or something embarrassing, something intimate, something you want to hide. The scope of personal information in law, which is what the law protects, is actually very broad. So let's quickly take a look at what that is. So this is the definition taken from the Australian Privacy Act. That we do have a patchwork of privacy laws in Australia. States and territories are in on the game as well, but for the private sector, the Federal or Australian Privacy Act is pretty much what you're looking at. So the definition in the Australian Privacy Act is that personal information means any information or an opinion. So it doesn't have to be intimate, private, embarrassing, sensitive, any information or an opinion about an individual. So not about companies. Corporations don't have privacy. It's an individual human right. And that individual must be identified or reasonably identifiable. So that means that if you can put 2 and 2 together to maybe figure out who the person is, that will make them reasonably identifiable. So it doesn't just mean identifiable on the face of this piece of data. If it can be combined with other data sources to identify the person, it will meet this definition. And this is a threshold legal definition. If something meets the definition of personal information, then the Privacy Act will apply to it, and all the privacy principles, which are your legal obligations, will kick in. So the scope of what's regulated by privacy law is very broad. And as I said, there's privacy principles which regulate how you handle personal information, and it's how you handle that personal information across the entire life cycle of that information. So if you think about information as having a life cycle, like, you know, something is organic, it's born, it lives, it dies. In the life cycle of information, at some point, an organization will collect it. In the middle of its life, it's going to hold it or store it in some way. And at the end of its life, you will dispose of it in some way. And you've got a whole bunch of obligations listed in the 13 privacy principles in Australia throughout that life cycle. So just briefly, at the time of collection, the rules say things like only collect what's the minimum necessary to fulfill your core functions. Make sure you are transparent, so explain to people what it is you're collecting. Ideally, collect it directly from them rather than via a third party. Don't use intrusive methods or ask intrusive questions, for example. So a bunch of obligations around collection. And I should say also, there's some tougher standards. Sometimes the rules are slightly tougher for a subcategory of personal information called sensitive information. And this includes things like health and disability information, ethnicity, sexuality, criminal records, and a few other categories. They broadly, but not completely, overlap with categories of in anti-discrimination law. But importantly, health and disability information as well. So some slightly tougher standards for when you can even collect those kinds of information. Then in the middle of its life, in the middle of the life cycle, you've got a bunch of obligations, including maintaining the security of that data, giving the subject, the person who the information is about, they have rights to access and seek amendment or correction of the personal information you hold about them. You've got an obligation to maintain the accuracy or the data quality of that information. There's limitations on what you can use the personal information for, and there's limitations on to whom and in what circumstances you can disclose that information to a third party. And then at the end of its life, the obligation is to dispose of that information in an appropriate time frame and in a secure fashion. So privacy is not just about not disclosing. It's not the same as confidentiality or secrecy, which are really just about not disclosing. And it's not exactly the same as data protection or information security or cybersecurity, which is all about, in privacy law, what's called the data security principle. But your privacy obligations cover not disclosing when you're not supposed to, keeping it secure, but it also covers a whole bunch of other obligations, as I said, throughout that life cycle as well. So that is Australian privacy law in a nutshell. So now what I'm going to move on to is kind of, what's happening right now in the regulatory space, what's new, what's happening next. So first of all, let's just talk about locally. So the regulator in this space, the privacy regulator for the Federal Privacy Act, is the OAIC, which is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, which includes the Privacy Commissioner. And I've seen a few things that suggest to me that the OAIC is slowly changing tack, through speeches, through comments from the Privacy Commissioner, things like that, through submissions made to, the ACCC's various inquiries into the digital platforms and so on. So certainly the Privacy Commissioner, Angelo, has been signalling that she is more willing than her predecessors to use what's called the Section 52 determination. So this is basically when someone's got a privacy complaint, instead of just conciliating that and settling that relatively privately, a Section 52 determination is like it's like the OAIC putting out a legal judgment. They're not exactly like a judge or a court, but they would publish decisions that have some kind of precedent-setting value. So she's certainly talked about she's more willing to use that power than her predecessors. She's also embraced what's known as the co-regulatory model. So lots of cooperation between the OAIC and the ACCC as our kind of consumer protection and trade practices regulator. So joining forces between two different regulators to tackle industries and subjects like, say, digital platforms. the OAIC's submissions to the ACCC's recent inquiry, so digital platforms, ad tech, consumer loyalty schemes, also suggest a fresh focus on some issues. So as I mentioned, one of the collection principles is about not using invasive or unfair practices. And the OAIC's more recently actually started to call out things like whether or not the means of collection of personal information is fair. And if it's not fair, does that not even meet the law? It's not just an ethical test, but a legal test. So they've called that out in relation to the customer loyalty schemes, for example. So, your flyby type schemes, but also in relation to ad tech profiling and tracking of consumers. So they've actually started to query whether some of that kind of tracking and profiling behaviour breaches Australian Privacy Principle 3.5, which is the rule that says collect only by fair means, especially if consumers, if the practices are opaque, so if consumers don't actually know what's going on. So an example they've given is customer loyalty schemes, which will track your transactions even if you don't hand over your Flybuys type card, they're still tracking your transactions. So that's something that they're calling out as being part of their new focus. And the other is questioning whether or not there should be an overarching test about fairness for use. So not just fair collection practices, but when you then come to use personal information, should the Australian Privacy Act be reformed to incorporate a kind of broad fairness test? So that is something that was raised by the ACCC in its digital platforms inquiries. The OAIC is now helping to push that idea along with the government, and the government has, the federal government has made an in-principle decision to reform the Privacy Act in 2020, 2021 along those lines. So we're yet to see any detail, but I think that's the general direction that we're moving in. And then the final issue relevant to you, again, this was recommended by the ACCC in its digital platforms inquiry and supported and pushed along by the OAIC, which is whether or not targeted marketing should be only on an opt-in basis. So consumers would have to proactively opt in. So that's what's happening right now locally. Let's look at global developments now. So you're probably aware there's been a bit of what's been nicknamed the techlash, so backlash against big tech, Facebook in particular, Google a little bit, Amazon to a lesser extent, Apple and Microsoft. A lot of that's come out of the Facebook Cambridge Analytica expose. I think, this was sort of gaining pace earlier at the beginning of this year. I think it's gone into a bit of abeyance during the pandemic, and I think there's a lot of tech solutionism and hoping that big tech is actually somehow going to save us all. So I'm waiting to see whether the tech clash comes back in force or dies away entirely, but that's certainly something that we've seen globally, not just locally. And also that co-regulatory model, so consumer protection and privacy regulators joining forces. The ACCC globally is being watched very carefully by the privacy community. Globally, they're very much the first ones to come out and do a big inquiry into Facebook and Google in particular, but they're by no means isolated. So this is increasingly something that's happening between different types of regulators. And that focus on big tech is also coming from the privacy regulators. So it's not just privacy advocates or consumer advocates, it's the regulators themselves. So John Edwards is the New Zealand Privacy Commissioner, and New Zealand, despite being a very small country, has always punched above its weight in the privacy community, and he's a very influential globally as a privacy regulator. And he gave a fantastic speech at a conference last year where he called on regulators need to join forces to deal with the power asymmetry of the big tech companies. So he's actually talking about not just the consumer and competition regulators and privacy regulators, but also online safety regulators, and to a lesser extent, those covering intellectual property and publishing issues like copyright and defamation. And his position is very much actually informed by the Christchurch massacre. So he's sort of, I think that's kind of galvanised thinking in New Zealand in particular. And globally, we've had a particular focus on ad tech. If you are not already aware of a case called the Planet 49 case in Europe, this decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union said that cookies need consent. So third-party and tracking cookies in particular, and that the consent of the user of that website or the consent of the consumer must be opt-in. It must be proactive. It can't be an opt-out. It can't be default. It can't be bundled in with other things. And that decision we're seeing play out with, decisions of, browsers to start just blocking third-party cookies, for example. Also, the French privacy regulator, CNIL, issued a 50 million euro fine for Google, again on the grounds where the law in Europe said you need consent to deliver personalized ads, and the way that Google had gone about trying to gain that consent was not considered valid in privacy law under European privacy law. We've seen a lot of focus on artificial intelligence and ethics in particular. So that's not just in the kind of ad tech space at all. That's a big global focus for privacy regulators at the moment. And then we've got some new privacy laws. So the CCPA is a Californian consumer privacy law. And coming out of Europe, eventually we should see a new e-privacy regulation. And that will be specifically regulating cookies and email marketing and related topics. So there is already an existing law in Europe, but it's not hasn't been implemented uniformly across the 28 member states in the European Union, and the e-privacy regulation is supposed to bring some better uniformity across the union. The CCPA in particular, the Californian one, is about allowing people to opt out of data brokering, and including, impacting particular on ad tech. And in particular, if it's children's data, they should only be allowed to be included if they've opted in. And I think that is still, it only started January this year, still playing out how that's supposed to work in practice, but that is going to continue to have kind of rippling effects across the industry. And back to Europe, there's been a lot of activity and some strategic litigation from privacy advocates around ad tech and third-party data sharing in apps. There's a particularly active group called None of Your Business, and there's also a group in Norway, the Norwegian Consumer Council, that has published a lot of research in this area, and they're quite influential. Okay, so what's next? So back to Australia, the immediate flow and effect from the digital platforms inquiry from the ACCC was, first of all, the next report was the Customer Loyalty Schemes report, now doing an inquiry into ad tech. The OAIC, so the privacy regulator, is supposed to be later this year putting out a code, and code is legally binding, on online platforms. And then, as I said, the federal government has made an in-principle agreement to review and reform the Federal Privacy Act along the lines of most of the ACCC's recommendations. And what are we likely to see in that review? Yes, not necessarily all of these things will impact on all of you, but possibly abolishing some of the exemptions, such as the small business exemptions. At the moment, there's exemptions to the exemptions, but for the moment, most businesses with less than a $3 million turnover are exempt. Media companies in the pursuit of journalism are exempt. So some political parties are exempt. Some of those exemptions might go or be watered down or have further carve-outs. Much focus on improving and bolstering the definitions of consent. So what does it mean to have a valid, what are the elements of a valid consent under privacy law? And in particular, impact on you, the definition of personal information. So a recommendation from the ACCC that definition explicitly include online identifiers, including cookies and other kind of tracking technologies. Possibly a tougher rules around the secondary use or disclosure of personal information. So as I mentioned, the OAIC is talking about an overriding fairness test, and maybe targeted marketing and profiling for ad tech will be opt-in only. The GDPR is the current European privacy law, and they have extra what's known as data subject rights. So here we have rights of access and correction. They've also got rights of erasure or deletion, algorithmic fairness, transparency. So possibly we'll see the Australian law beefed up to try and mirror the European law. Increased focus on accountability through methodologies like privacy impact assessments on new projects, possibly making the idea of privacy by design mandatory. So the idea that you have to build in your new products, services, technology systems, start from a position of privacy by design, possibly privacy by default even. OEICs obviously going for more powers and bigger budget, and possibly a direct right of action, meaning consumers could sue companies directly for breaches of the privacy principles rather than have to go through the privacy regulator, the OAIC. Okay, so just wrapping up some of the key takeaway messages for you today. The first thing to always remember is that the breadth of what is covered by the definition of personal information can surprise people. It's not just about protecting private data, and privacy is not just about protecting secrets. It's about how organisations handle all the data they have that is not secret. And privacy is not just about data security. It's not just about preventing disclosures. It is also about how personal information can and can't be collected and used. And it's all about doing that collection, doing that use in a way that does no harm to individuals. And above all else, privacy law is about fairness, accuracy, and transparency. So those key trends, both locally and globally, include applying a consumer protection lens over the top of privacy law, seeing how the law might need to expand to cover all forms of privacy harm that can arise, and that focus on fairness is also a key trend, with what can be seen in particular as unfair or unclear, opaque collection practices in ad tech now, particularly under the regulator's microscope, and we might end up with an opt-in only law. My final point is that the Australian privacy law at the moment rests on that notion of identifiability. Remembering our definition of personal information is that the person is reasonably identifiable, but the ACCC has recommended expanding that to include online identifiers, whether that's web beacons, cookies, etc., even if you can't necessarily link the identifier to a named or nameable person. So that was it from me. I just wanted to let you know, if you want more information, Salinger Privacy has a whole bunch of resources and training things for you. We also have a monthly blog, which you can sign up, obviously on a purely opt-in basis. You can sign up to receive our newsletter via the footer on our website. Our monthly blog has won some writing awards, prompted law reform in the past, and triggered a boycott of the last census. So don't miss out on that. So that's it from me. Thank you for your attention this morning, and I'm going to throw back to JJ and possibly Ben, and I'll stick around and happy to answer any questions as they arise.
Thank you so much, Anna. I think you can see why it's so important to have that quality and level of advice from a privacy perspective. So that access to expertise is brilliant, and Anna will be staying with us, worry not, towards the end as we have the Q&A. And I'm quickly going to first update you on what we're up to here at the IAB. So these webinars are the effort of the Data Council that's been around for a couple of years now. We are in the process of updating the handbook from 2017 to a updated 2020 version that we're calling the 2020 Data Primer. This is in the final editorial phases, and it should be published in the next couple of weeks, so please look out for that. We're looking to define the different types of data, and part of that is to define explicitly some of the differences between identifiers and identity, as well as the different data types. And then we go through the aspects of guidance around collection, management, usage, execution, and the topic that we have today in terms of privacy and governance. Some of the information that you heard there from Anna will be including in the document, but also with links to the relevant information that you can find from both government and expert partners. So do look out for that. We finish it off with some attribution from one of our council members. Now, one of the projects within this that I'm quite proud that we've worked so hard on this here in Australia. I think it's outside of the US, we're the market that's really been proactive around this standard, which utilizes the data transparency standards from TechLab, and it's called Data Label. You'll see some links coming through from Tiffany on this, and we've worked quite hard on this here recently through the council and a dedicated working group. And the idea being that you have a nutritional label of audience segments. So this isn't, whilst it sets up perhaps a consumer engagement piece with some consistency, this is more of an industry standard in terms of looking at the makeup of segments and being consistent in the naming conventions, transparent in terms of the details of what lies therein. So here we have an example from Audience 360, which is the AFL fans, so those that are regularly and consistently engaging with AFL content. And you can see that these are the minimum disclosure requirements that we have. There's a lot more details that can sit within the labels themselves, but you get a sense of exactly where the data is coming from, how often it's refreshed, the recency, the IDs that you utilize, and anything else. So this has been an important standard that we'd like to see adopted more widely. So we've worked on local labels, and we'll probably look within the next month or two to provide the most prevalently traded segments and start pushing for some standardization in those as a starting point. We actually have 3 of our members, 2 data suppliers and an agency, involved in a pilot of the database of labels that will be a global database that's currently in beta. It'll be available on datalabel.org. From an initial perspective, this is a free service. The automation of the update and input of the labels, which is currently manual, we're looking to automate that with APIs, and you'll be able to search through the various labels and the constituents at ease. So this is a global project, but we're really being very proactive on it here and really wanting to ensure that we've got Australian representation and we're adhering to the best global standards. There is a separate process of compliance and certification that's taking place mainly in the US, run by TechLab. We'll provide a bit more information on that, but for now we want to get to the point of awareness and adoption and standardization of the standard itself, and then we can talk a bit more about compliance. Some of our members are involved in that compliance program, some of the big global players, but we'll come to that. That's not currently part of what we're doing here locally, but that's to come. Another piece of work that you may have seen is our submission into the ACCC. So if you go to the ACCC site, you'll be able to see some of the submissions there that are public. Be aware that there are public submissions as well as confidential submissions. Our submission is public. You can see it on our site. Tiff will share some links with you. We also have built out a page of all the standards that we feel are related to this particular issues paper, which was specifically on the AdTech inquiry. So have a look at that, and if there are any questions on that, please feel free to ask. And finally, we're working on the ADAPT. So these are at publication stage. Look out for them in the next couple of weeks. Certainly by mid-June, we'll look to have launched and announced them. These are being worked on in conjunction with the AANA and the MFA, and certainly includes topics relevant to this, relevant to governance and privacy. That includes sort of top-level information, but also checklists. We want to be able to provide advertisers, agencies, and publishers with just good starting point in terms of best practices, but what to take into consideration. So we're really looking forward to be able to get these out and updated for the industry. So we'll now move back to the panelists, and I'll leave you in the capable hands of Ben Sharp. So Sharp, if you can take away as the host with the most for this Q&A. And if there are any questions for me, I'm happy to jump in. But if you start, we'll leave this slide actually, sorry, and then you can take over, Sharpie. So off you go.
Sure thing. Thank you, JJ. Just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Yes, fantastic. First up, I want to say a massive thank you to Anna. That 25 minutes of privacy was fascinating, and I think it's so relevant to everything that we are all doing on a day-to-day basis in each of our roles. So very much want to thank you for that, and yes, super interesting hearing your insights. I especially like the anecdote about the Porsche, and it's so relevant to everything that we think about. I'd also like to introduce two other people on the panel, and a huge thank you for joining us today as well. Yun Yip, who's the VP and Country Manager at MediaMath, and also Angelo Sinibaldi, who's the Director of Data Products at Nine. So I think we're very fortunate to have all three of you to join us for this discussion. And like myself and JJ, I think we've each been around the industry for quite some time, and it's seen quite a lot of change over the past, 10 years or more. But I wanted to kick off with a question, which I think I'll probably throw to Yun first, and that is that, having heard what we just have from Anna, what are the things that brands can do to ensure that they treat customers' data with respect? And are there examples of best practice that you can identify, either within your own business or amongst the customers and partners that you work with?
Yeah, that's a good question to kick things off. And as a business, we at MediaMath have actually built a whole infrastructure. So that's be it policy or technology around how we can actually protect user privacy, respect their consent, whilst actually driving business outcomes. So how we actually get that done is to always work with industry bodies such as that of the IAB, but also to take the different regulations and laws into consideration. Another example in Australia as well is to also work with the likes of ACCC to be part of the various inquiries where as it actually arises. And to that end, I would also say that right down to our technology, we will always ensure that the users have the choice to either have the choice to actually access the data as well and understand what is being collected and used, and also to delete it as and when they would wish to do that. So what this really means is how we would want to work with our clients and our partners as well, from a data as well as from a supply partner perspective, is to work with clients who have the similar values as well as the same level of integrity when we actually do think about the internet, the free and open internet that we want to have. So then in terms of best practices, I would also say is always engage with experts. If you don't have experts in-house, always look to experts such as that of Salinger Privacy as an example, right? To always ensure that you have the best advice on how to navigate a very, very complex landscape.
Thanks, Yun. Angelo, as a brand that works very closely with, some of Australia's largest brand advertisers, really interested to hear your perspective as well to, find some of the things that, brands are doing to ensure that they do keep, treat their customers' data with respect.
Yeah, look, I'm going to break this response down into sort of three components, and this is obviously, and I've probably spent close to 2 decades working in the data industry, and now for the last sort of just under 5 years at Nine. But there's three things you can in effect do. First of all, I think as an individual, you need to understand the Australian privacy principles that apply in the jurisdiction that you actually work in and that your brand is actually operating in. So I understand a lot of global tech companies operate across multi-jurisdictions, but you really do need to understand, certainly where you're getting PII data, what the law land are, and that's the 13 Australian privacy principles. So have actually been really written in a plain English format. So they're easily digestible. 2, you should also read and understand your privacy policy and make sure that that actually reflects that you're actually complying with the Australian privacy principles. And 3 is actually dealing with reputable data partners or technology providers. So it's around understanding the law on a personal level, making sure that your organisation reflects the laws of the land through the privacy policy, and then obviously dealing with reputable, whether it be tech, ad tech, technology players that are actually reputable. They're businesses that large brands and like actually utilise. So there's probably 3 parts of that sort of answer.
Yeah, thanks, Angelo. That's fantastic. At MediaMath, you're exposed to developments across the world in a whole range of other markets, and especially those that are moving quickly in Europe with GDPR and the US with CCPA. Interested in knowing what you feel an Australian audience can learn from some of the changes that you're seeing happen in other markets.
Yeah, I think I'll start this off by just saying that when we actually do think about the companies out there, particularly in EdTech, most companies actually do want to do the right thing. So I think that's the very first point that I'll bring up. But the other one is that, the GDPR and the CCPA regulations, what ACCC is trying to do at the moment, the standards of IAB are actually a force for good. So those are the first 2 key points I want to bring up. But in terms of what we can actually learn from some of the regulations that actually come into play, I'll take the GDPR as an example to start with, because it's probably one of the first ones that kicked off about 2 years ago. What we have been able to see as a summary negatively has been a decrease in competition and revenue for some companies. But on the upside, what we have also been able to see are that all tech companies, data companies, as well as clients who actually have to touch user data are now taking a more thoughtful approach to how to user consent and user privacy, and what they actually do choose to do with the data. One of the things that I do think Australia as a market can do a little bit better at will be from a brand as well as from a publisher perspective. I don't necessarily think we've done enough to articulate what user data is actually used for. Because I don't necessarily believe that a user is just uncomfortable with data being used, but it's just for the fact that there are a lot of unknowns out there that hasn't actually been made transparent to the consumer. How is my data used? Is it getting passed on? How is it stored? Can I delete it? It's going to be a fair education for all, but I think these are some areas that we can definitely improve on as an industry.
Thanks, you, and it's so topical. Many of those comments especially are the transparent use of consumer data, which really leads me to something I wanted to ask Angelo, and that is that Nine have spent a lot of time building a publisher ID across the Nine network and across your digital properties. Can you talk a bit to how you started on this process, what you're actually solving for, and how this is ensuring consumer privacy and consent, whilst also at the same time offering those great opportunities for your advertising customers?
Yeah, so I'll go back into the past. So I've actually been with Nine since about 2016. The process of building out the Nine user ID, which is in effect, what I refer to a customer number, maybe similar to a bank number when you actually sign up with a major sort of bank and the like. So this was all started when they were designing the relaunch of Nine Now. So the Nine Now platform was launched in 2016, at the start of 2016. It used to be called Nine Jump In. And what the business was doing was actually applying for the first time. It was seen as groundbreaking at the time to actually apply an authentication page where you needed to log in with your PII data, whether it was across engaging with Nine Now through web or through the apps. So the role of the non-user ID or publisher ID at the time when it was created, designed to create a device and link obviously an authentication event on web authentication across your device and linking those two together. So it was creating a device graph. Over time, that has been extended across CTVs. That has allowed us, 2 years ago, to then develop what is an addressable TV, or what I refer to as, targeting the living room, or people-based marketing in the living room. And this is fundamentally, again, something that didn't happen overnight. You've got to understand that, creating device graphs or publisher IDs does actually take time, but it all starts with an authentication event to a degree, certainly as we start to move into the people-based environments. So that was probably one of the first keys. Obviously, with the merger with the former FAC business, that 9-user ID was obviously extended across all the different enterprise subsidiaries to what I consider to be now probably one of the largest privately owned device graphs that actually exists in Australia, outside of the two global players of Google and actually Facebook. So I think that's sort of the real key here. What it ultimately allows you to do as a brand or an advertiser is obviously to start moving into this world of people-based advertising. And I think that's really, really key. I think once, in effect, I'm an old school direct marketer who's been in the digital industry the last 5 years. From my perspective, I think what brands and advertisers want is the ability to target people. And I think for many, many years, they've not had that capacity over the last couple of years outside of Google and Facebook. So I think what we're now finding is that, that publisher provided ID is basically giving you an idea at a personal level, which allows you to target across multiple different devices when you're actually buying that particular imagery. I think that's really, really a good outcome for the business, because it then plays back to sort of Yun's perspective around sort of transparency. Yeah, collect data. Why we're collecting the data is to make sure that you have a really good advertising experience when you actually engage with some of these media businesses that exist within Australia.
Thanks, Angelo. Unfortunately, the tech seems to be dropping in and out a little bit. I might ask you to maybe turn your video off. I'm hoping that would help with the quality of the connections. I know your comments are absolute gold, and I definitely want to be able to, and everyone else would love to be able to hear everything as best as possible. But I guess there's a follow-up question that has actually come to us from the audience, and I think it relates in part to this discussion around a publisher ID, and that is a universal opt-in possible for consumers to avoid friction and consent fatigue? And is this of something that you see, developing further within the Nine network and elsewhere? I think there's both an operational question for you, Angelo, and also I might throw part of this question as well afterwards to Anna, because I think this probably opens up some other privacy and legal questions about how that consent can be captured in a universal opt-in manner.
Yeah, look, universal opt-ins, I don't know whether that is actually possible. I mean, unless an industry body that overarches across all Australian digital businesses, again, I think it's probably something that the industry could potentially play in, but I think it would be really incredibly difficult. I mean, if you think about a universal ID that sits above a publisher ID, that's going to be really difficult for everybody to come together. I just don't know how an opt-in across the whole industry could sort of align. But again, it's really tied to the industry coming together. Again, it's a question of upholstery. Is there a benefit for the consumer in that regards?
Yep, I absolutely understand your comments there. Anna, just following on from that, do you see that there is a path to a universal opt-in? Is it even possible? And what kind of privacy questions would it open up?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. Thanks, Ben. And if, as Angelo and I are both assuming, you're talking universal meaning across multiple companies or brands or enterprises, then I think that actually throws up a whole bunch of, challenges. The first is that Australians in particular really hate universal identifiers. You know, in the 80s, we knocked back the Australia card. In the noughties, we knocked back the access card. It's something that kind of peculiar to Australians, that say Europeans don't feel the same way about universal identifiers and identity cards. And, you know, the online equivalent may not go down so well in the Australian environment. But even if you leave aside that kind of cultural issue, there's the notion of consent is already moving in the direction of being strengthened, or the elements you need to enable or to have a consent that is valid under privacy law. We've got notions like that consent must be voluntary. So you absolutely have the ability to say no and still get the service or good that you're looking for. So that's your first hurdle. So it must be voluntary, it must be specific, and it must be informed. So the second that you're actually talking about a universal ID across multiple companies, that's going to be really difficult, because to gather a legally valid consent, you need to be specific about exactly what that identifier is going to be used for. And that's going to be incredibly difficult. That's difficult enough for one company to explain, let alone multiple companies. So most of the time I actually suggest people, where possible, don't try to rely on consent to enable their information handling practices. So when we're giving advice to clients, what we're normally doing is looking at the data flows. So we talk about what information is going to be collected, how is it going to be used, who disclosed to, how disposed of at the end of its life cycle. And at each one of those points, that data flow must be authorized in law. And consent is one of the grounds that will give you that legal authority, but it's not the only ground. And because it is so hard to actually get a legally valid consent, you've got to jump all these different hurdles. It's often what's often held up as the gold standard. It's actually almost the last thing that you would go to. So you would look at other legal grounds that would enable you to collect, use, and disclose personal information. And that's usually that, you know, you're being open and transparent, and you're limiting the purposes for which you're going to use it. You're doing it in a fair way. If you can meet those other rules, then you just shy away from consent entirely. I'm not saying that you wouldn't need consent for a universal identifier. That's probably the only ground you could move forward on. But in terms of trying to solve the original problem that you mentioned, which is consent fatigue, I'm always suggesting to our clients, you know, don't even go down the path of asking for consent if you don't really need it in law, because there's easier and more pragmatic options. And the problem with asking for consent is the second someone says no, or in fact someone is just simply silent, doesn't give you a proactive yes, you can't rely on consent to do what it is you want to do. So it's not useful for routine business practices. You need to look at the Australian privacy principles and the other grounds on which you can proceed.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Angelo. There has been a great question posted in the chat from someone in the audience, and unfortunately it comes through as anonymous. So I want to thank Anonymous for the question. It's a question very close to my heart, and I'll read it out verbatim. Question relating to brands and publishers using a data management platform. Will these be redundant if Chrome blocks cookies? Angelo, I know you at the Nine Network have, you know, been building a data asset out for quite some time. Really interested in your perspective on the future for DMPs, not just for the next 18 months to 2 years, but also the role of a DMP post the changes that Google are bringing into play in 2022.
Yeah, really good question, and it's interesting though, because it has been something that's been incredibly topical over the last 12 months. Certainly from what I see from the large global MarTech players, whether it be Salesforce or Adobe, is probably 12, 18 months ago, nobody talked about CDPs. And I think what you've found with those two particular organizations is there's been a movement towards creating CDP-like capabilities. And I think that's in effect what's going to happen. I think you're going to see DMPs evolve to obviously incorporate a level of PR and then have all of those capabilities that actually exist within a CDP. But ultimately, the deprecation of cookies by Google, what that basically in effect means is that the way DMPs link to destinations will need to change, and that will be built around some type of customer or publisher style ID. And I think there's work already across a number of platforms and the like where that is actually occurring. So where something has been maybe custom built, I think it's just going to be standard. But yes, you will see an evolution of DMPs to incorporate CDP type capabilities. And I think that sort of, that's already in motion, and you can certainly see the updates coming both out of Salesforce and Adobe and the like, sort of definitely signaling that particular thing. I don't think DMPs will be sunsetted. I think they'll just in effect evolve.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here
agree.
as well, if that's okay.
Go for it. Yeah, and I'd love to hear your comments here. Absolutely.
Thanks, Sharpie. I think at the end of the day, it's not necessarily all a bad thing with, the third-party cookie going away, because at the end of the day, when you think about how we are consuming media, that is getting more and more fragmented as well. And a lot of our media consumption is not cookie-based anymore. Like, it's not just, we're not just reliant on display browser or mobile browser. So I do agree with what Angelo was saying, is that, what we actually do end up having to process within a DMP or a CDP will actually shift. But for it to be redundant, it's something that I don't think will happen, because there are first-party solutions. There are ways in which we can use authenticated user signals and bidirectional data transfers to help us get over the cookie crumble.
Absolutely. And I think, if I was to, and I love to participate in these discussions because it's something that I am involved in a day-to-day basis, and building on something that Angelo actually mentioned earlier in the discussion, the role of DMPs absolutely will evolve over the next couple of years. And we're seeing that happen already. And one of the first things that we're seeing, in addition to the development of CDPs, but using your first-party data in a valuable and trusted way with trusted partners in a second-party data marketplace is what we are now starting to see DMPs being able to deliver, both for brands and also for publishers. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this start to develop over the next 12 months. And it, is a way for brands to capture consent, to control the use of data, and to trade that data in a privacy compliant way with those trusted partners that they have out there. Now, I think we're almost at time. No discussion at the moment would be complete without a mention of COVID and the environment that we're in. And I'm happy to say that we've gone almost an entire hour without mentioning the current crisis. So I want to thank everyone for that. But I do want to just end with a question for Anna. Hopefully you can answer this, but I'm interested in your perspective of one of your recent blog posts about the COVID Safe app, and whether the use of data in that app is something that we, as the average consumer out there, should be in any way concerned about.
Yeah, good question. So the COVID Safe app, I have written a blog, and the gist of my blog is that everyone should actually think about their own circumstances, about whether the app is appropriate for them. And I know that sounds like a really boring kind of product disclosure statement, but it is important to, as with any kind of digital tool, know what it is you're doing before you download it. The government has done an exceptionally good job, and I'm very excited by the job they've done in thinking about the design of the app, and in particular, moving forward very quickly with bespoke legal protections. They've recognised that actually getting privacy right was going to help with health outcomes, not hinder them, because they needed to gain public trust to, to get large numbers of people to download and use the app. People need to trust it, and to do that, they had to very quickly make and then back up with law privacy promises around the use of the data. So I think they've done what they can in terms of absolutely locking down the use. So there is no secondary use of this data allowed. It is only for health agencies at the state and territory government level to do contact tracing, full stop. There's no secondary use. There'll be no researchers even allowed. Even health researchers won't be allowed access to this data. There's no law enforcement access, except to enforce the law about the privacy protections themselves. So I think that's a really good thing. There are some categories of people who face higher privacy and safety risks than others, and they should think carefully about whether their risks, whether the benefits to them and the community and family around them outweigh their risks. So in particular, people in violent or abusive or controlling relationships should think very carefully, as with any technology on their phone that could be used by an abusive partner as kind of spyware. So that's one scenario that people need to think about. And there's some other people who might want to actually protect the other people they meet with or the communities they socialize with. So if you are a journalist speaking to a whistleblower, for example, you're going to think carefully about that. If you're in witness protection, if you're an undercover police officer, these are not apps for you. But for the vast majority of people in Australia who don't have any of those particular kind of privacy or safety risks to worry about, I think the app, and more importantly, it's not the app, it's the database that sits behind the app that really matters. And the way that the, at least the legal protections have been designed, have been to absolutely lock that down to only its primary purpose and nothing further, which is a great thing to enable that kind of public trust, which will encourage people to download the app and therefore have the public health benefits that are intended. And I actually think this is a great example of governments realizing the importance of privacy and the correlation between privacy protection and trust. And you need that trust to achieve whatever your outcomes are, whether it's public health or something else. Actually, the public do care about privacy, and getting your design of your systems and the legal protections and everything else that sits around it is really critically important.